Hey, thanks so much for coming out on a Saturday. It's actually a beautiful day, in spite of what we were warned in the weather forecast. I really appreciate your being here. I'm going to read for about like 8 to 10 minutes, and if you feel as though there are bugs crawling all over your skin, just raise your hand and say, you've been reading too long and I feel as though there are bugs crawling all over my skin, and I won't be offended at all. I totally understand. I'll stop reading. It's all good. Sorry. Back in grammar school, they taught us all about crocodiles and what to do if you ever meet one. Don't try to run, because you're on their territory, and they can ensnare you in one of their long tentacles before you take your first stride. Plus, they can clear vast distances with their powerful hind legs, each one the size of an adult human, and their strong forelegs can climb any surface and dig through almost any barrier. You might be able to hide, because we don't know how they sense their prey. They can't rely on vision or hearing in this pitch-dark wind. They may use scent, or maybe they detect motion somehow. Nobody's ever hidden from one, but you might be the first. The only real viable strategy, though, is to attack. Crocodiles do have a few weaknesses that a human can exploit. They have soft spots on their underbelly where the carapace doesn't extend all the way around. I know where all of their major organs are because I watched Frank the Butcher carve one up for some fancy banquet after a few hunters had gotten lucky, returning from the night in one piece and with fresh game. But their main weakness, the easiest one to reach, is the exact center of the pincer that's right in front of me right now, sticking out of the creature's head. The impenetrable shell contains 2 knife-sharp claws, but at their midpoint is a forest of 100 wriggling tongues, each one about the size of your little finger. If you manage to strike at the pincer's heart and hit those slimy appendages dead on, then you might kill it in one stroke. That pincer is so close, I can feel one of its edges scrape against my throat. It could slice my head off before I could even react. I try to summon all of my courage, brace my feet on the slippery ground to deliver one great blow to the warm spot at the pincer's fulcrum. I can do this. I'm strong enough. I raise both fists. Then I stop. Because I can feel warm breath coming from below this pincer where the creature's mouth is, and that part of me that's always standing back and pulling everything apart instead of just blurting out words all the time is asking, why is a crocodile's mouth so far away from all of these tongues anyway? She can't possibly be using them to taste anything or to make any sounds. Why are they right at the center of this armored scissor, vulnerable yet shielded? I lower my fists. Instead, I push my unprotected face forward, almost losing my balance in the dark. The pincer is all around my head and neck now, but it doesn't close and kill me. Instead, this crocodile lets me press my forward and push my frostburnt nose into the moist heat of her slimy, warm grubs. They brush my face, and my head floods with urgent smells and disorienting sounds. Of beautiful ugliness, too much to handle, and like I'm out of my head drunk with no up, no down, nothing but a whirl of sensory overload. I almost keel over, but somehow I stay upright until I'm somewhere else. I'm way out in the middle of the night now, surrounded by huge sheets of ice on all sides. A mountain of ice and snow sidles past along the horizon. We are thousands of kilometers out than any human has gone in 25 generations, since we lost all of our scout ships and our all-terrain vehicles. Somehow, I can see in the night now, except I realize I'm not seeing at all. I'm using alien senses, and my mind is turning them into sight and sound. I tear through the landscape so fast, the wind can't keep up. A sudden storm could rip me apart, the tundra could swallow me whole, but I don't even care. My back legs push against the ground and the ice surrenders, while my smaller front legs dig into the slick surface, propelling me even faster and keeping my balance. I'm not running. This is something much, much better. I've never felt so much power in my body and so many sensations flood into the ends of my two great tentacles as they taste the wind around me. I want to laugh. And then I turn and see that 4 other crocodiles are running alongside me, grasping some spiky devices in their tentacles and guiding a sled full of some precious metal. I feel a surge of pride, safety, happiness, that they're with me and we're going home. Then we reach it, a huge structure in the shape of a rose with all of its petals spread, a circle surrounded by elaborate crisscrossing arch shapes. Only the very top pokes above the surface and the rest extends far below the ice, but still, its beauty almost stops my heart. A glimmering city in the middle of the night, many times larger than Siosvand, that no human eyes have ever seen. So now I'm going to skip to the very end of the novel, but it's not a spoiler, I promise. And we're going to kind of revisit that same scene that I just read from the point of view of the creature that Sophie, the main character, was interacting with. Rose keeps reminding me of when we first met. She shows me how I looked back then, out on the ice, wearing my second-hand trendy clothes, dying, terrified. She showed me that memory before, but this time I can more easily identify with her perspective. I'm Rose, and I see this human shivering from cold and terrified rage, and she does that animal thing of tensing to fight or run. But then, instead, she does something that no human has ever willingly done before. Tilt her head back, let my tendrils touch her bare flesh. I feel Rose's surprise, her euphoria, her sense that something perverted and maybe wonderful is happening here. I try to ask Rose the question that's been bothering me ever since I came to the city in the middle of the night. What do the Gelet, these creatures, believe in? I have to ask several times, and then she seems to get it, because she unfolds an ancient memory, the oldest one that anybody has ever shared with me. Or maybe not a memory, maybe a legend, or a little of both. I can tell its age by the smooth edges, the lack of sensory detail, and the easy flow of the events, the same way that humans can spot when a story has been told and retold by a long chain of people, because it makes too much sense. Long ago, before the first civilization rose up on this planet, everyone lived in scattered burrows all over the night, with no more than 100 people per burrow. They wove their tendrils together whenever anybody wanted to share information about what she had seen or what she had done, or somebody might come up with a simple idea that she shared with everyone else, like a way to harvest more roots and grubs to feed into the web where their children were developing, or how to strengthen their barriers against ice slides and avalanches. And that's when their greatest love story took place. These two people who had grown up in different burrows came together after some brutal ice storms drove them away from their homes. The two refugees became inseparable, and their tendrils were intertwined whenever they weren't working or eating. They slept with their pincers wrapped around each other in their own mossy nook where the cool air ran over their carapaces. Their dreams flowed back and forth between them, and their memories of fleeing their homes blended together until they almost shared the same past. Everyone else recoiled because this couldn't possibly be healthy for them. Plus, they were excluding the rest of the community, which was hurtful. People tried to pry the two of them apart physically, or sent one or the other of them off on long errands outside the burrow. At last, one of the oldest and most patient of the burrow's residents decided to talk to both of them together and find out exactly what perversion they had been drawn into. And then there were 3 of them. Entangled, inextricable, people began talking about evicting all 3 of them. What had seduced these three into such an unnatural closeness? A set of designs for a water wheel, using the nearby underground river to operate a crude mill that would help them separate out the poisonous part of some mushrooms that grew in the nearby caves. This was such a complex idea that one person couldn't possibly invent it alone and then share it with everyone else. The concept needed to be shaped among 2 or more people working together. They couldn't even share it with the others until they had the concept. And these lovers had discovered a powerful thrill, a joy that went all the way down to their stomachs in weaving a big idea together, like some wild rapture, the sensation of helping others to imagine something bigger than yourselves. Somehow, this weird love story is the foundation of this community's politics, or maybe religion. Rose lingers on the oddest parts, like when they finally reveal their invention to the rest of the community, or the tenderness when this couple becomes a trio. I sense the echoes from all of the countless other times that people have passed this legend around, and the lesson that comes with it. To join with others to shape a future is the holiest act. This is hard work, and it never stops being hard. But this collective dreaming/designing is the only way that we get to keep surviving. And this practice defines us as a community. Even the other communities that live apart from the Midnight City, scattered all over the night in smaller cities or towns, they all share this same origin story. Thank you. And in case I forget, can we get a round of applause for Michelle, our sign language teacher?
Hi. Okay, is the microphone working? No.
Was. Oh shit, did I turn it off?
Okay, no. Now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I might have to hold this button here. All right. Okay. So I'm just gonna briefly explain some stuff before I begin, because even though it's like chapter 3, and yet somehow it's incomprehensible without a brief explanation. So first, basically, the book is centered around a love story between 2 characters, Ben and Kate. And Kate is really the main character. She's the one who travels in time, and she basically travels in time in her dreams. So she falls asleep, and in her dreams, she is a different person in the Elizabethan period. And then, as happens in time travel novels, the things that she does in the past change history, and therefore she wakes up in a different world every time she wakes up. So, so the basic things that you need to know is that the book begins in a world that is not our world, and it is a little bit better. So it's a slightly utopian world that feels like it's on the brink of becoming an even better world. So it's this moment of political hope in this semi-utopian world, where a woman named Chen has just been elected president, and she's like a Green Party candidate. So it's, obviously a very left-wing concept of what the utopian world is, for which I'm just going to be unapologetic. And the main character, Kate, spends most of her time living at the house or the large apartment of this woman, Sabine, who's kind of a wealthy girl who funds a lot of left-wing causes. And the apartment, this kind of large Upper East Side apartment, actually belongs to Sabine's uncle, who is mentioned in this section in B. The other 2 things you need to know is that there's an organization of runaway mail-order brides, and some of the mail-order brides are always living in these apartments. They're mentioned a few times. And the final thing, which is unnecessarily complicated, but I don't want you to feel left out of the joke, is that there is a mention of endangered grasses. So the grasses, basically Sabine has a friend who works in the mining industry in Argentina, and there are grasses that are being killed by the mining there, which are an endangered species. So he stole some and smuggled them back in his plane, and Sabine has these grasses growing on her roof deck. So that's all you need to know. I'm sorry, that seems like I almost should sit down again, but, but the reading is mercifully brief. So, okay, and this is from Ben's point of view, having just fallen in love. The first few weeks of being in love, what magic had meant to him when he was a child, what he wanted when he dreamed about riding a dragon, everything was that different. Just Kate's face looking up and seeing him. He'd walk across a dive bar to her smile, and then her hand in his that made his body ignite with pleasure. He felt it in his feet. On the wall behind her, a framed vintage advertisement for the Tour de France was blessed, was alive and significant, sexual. Nothing could be this good again. And already the scrambling vertigo of that, of clinging to this thin moment that wouldn't cling back. The fear when he glanced at her casually and felt nothing. The relief when she smiled and was amazing again. Or she might just leave you. Ben had a job at an energy industry journal, a job he downplayed and treated as a stopgap embarrassment, but secretly liked. He rewrote press releases. He had spats with his editor and drank 10 coffees. He attended conferences in Pittsburgh that were an ocean of suits in a Holiday Inn, where, at a certain hour of night, the suits started daring each other to look up strip clubs in the yellow pages. It was rote, it was soulless, a comfortable nothing, like going to an office to play cards all day. What was important now? It was a job you could leave at 5. Kate was never doing anything. He picked her up at Sabine's, and they walked all through New York, creating a personal geography of train stations where they'd kissed, and bars where they'd had breakthrough conversations. All through those last summer days that delicately chilled, became serious, became the first bright days of autumn. Everywhere, they were the couple in love. They were stars, cocooned, invulnerable, would be laughing happily on a jam-packed subway platform in its tropical reek and heat, while the F train just didn't come and the other travelers endured a stifled misery that Ben now couldn't even imagine. How had that stuff ever mattered to him? And back to Sabine's, it was always there. Ben's apartment was too grim. It had linoleum in the bedroom. Kate had a place, a shared house in Brooklyn, but somebody's brother was staying in her bedroom, and anyway, Kate didn't like bedrooms. They made her feel like a doll that had been put in a drawer. So it was Sabine's rooftop, where Kate was always stroking the endangered grass, mother hennishly, worried that it missed the Andes, that it wouldn't like the local rain. When there was local rain, they went indoors to the uncle's library, where Kate was in the habit of sleeping on a sheepskin rug. It had a semicircle of rosy smudges where Kate's lipstick had come off on the wool. With the addition of Ben, she brought a futon out, and they had sex for hours beneath the books that filled the walls to the ceiling. Books that seemed to solemnly think their 1,000 stories in the gloom beyond the light of the reading lamp, while Ben and Kate didn't think, but moaned and felt and were animals in that light. Outside the library door, it was politics. Sabine was the sort of rich girl who bankrolled left-wing political movements, squatters' rights and prison reform and open borders and a just plain communism. Her apartment was a churn of left-wing activists and local politicians, of reporters whose stories Sabine dictated, and moneyed friends who wrote her checks, of squatters and ex-convicts and refugees who came to her apartment in threadbare legations to second-guess everything she did. Often they stayed the night, and there were always staffers from Albany staying, who stank the place out with their cigarettes and shouted at the breakfast table, stabbing the air with a fork to make their points. There was also a shifting population of mail-order brides and miscellaneous, penniless riffraff, plus Martin the New Zealander garden designer, who had been grandfathered into the apartment as a condition of Sabine's own tenancy. Every weekend there was a party where these same people appeared in different clothes. There was one intimate party where everyone sat on the floor and told stories about times they'd been depressed. There was one uproarious party where the mail-order brides danced in bikini tops, and a stringer from La Prensa put her foot through one of the African drums. One Saturday there was an unplanned party because people kept turning up with wine, hoping there might be a party they hadn't heard about. At one presidential debate-watching party, a drunken state assemblyman told Sabine he wanted to leave his wife for her, and when Sabine turned him down, he locked himself in a bathroom and shaved his head. Kate knew everyone. They knew Kate. Half the men carried a torch for her. Women dragged her into bedrooms to tell her secrets. Ben was hers, so he was instantly A-list, included in kitchen powwows, and treated to coke, and offered jobs at the Jersey City mayor's office. It went to his head. He took sides. He cared. He became a fork-waving shouter at breakfast. He donated $20 bills and marched and went out knocking on doors in the Bronx. Just being in Sabine's crowd made him feel like a soldier in the good war. He was no longer just Ben for himself, but an invincible Ben for all mankind. And after all, it was the year 2000, Chen's year, the first year with no war at all, when you opened up the newspaper like opening a gift. A year of mass protests at which the same violin-playing blind girl would always appear and play the same Irish air. The year Les Giraffe occupied the embassy of Germany and flew the anarchist flag and the Jolly Roger from its broken windows. That best ever year, when Ben was first in love and began to spy utopia in bars and taquerias, in the inebriate dark of a much-used bed, on the rooftop, above and among the starry opulence of Upper Manhattan. He believed what Kate believed, and was always, in his mind, in a wine haze, dancing in a jostling swarm of mail-order brides and political hacks, while the world became the something else of dreams, of books, of Kate. Okay, thank you. Michelle, it's really, she's something all about work, community, your work is fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to do questions for a few. I don't know. I'm sorry, I spilled some water here. Does anybody have a paper towel? I spilled some water. I'm so sorry. Let me just grab my phone so I can keep track of time. Okay. So yeah, do anybody have questions for either of us? Questions? Or we could do a sing-along, or I don't know. Anybody? Hey, Scarf.
Well, Barbara, I'm wondering how you developed your characterization of Albany political hacks. Having grown up in upstate New York, it feels accurate. So.
I was briefly involved in a grassroots political group called New Democratic Majority, which was very much, it was all about electing more left-wing candidates to local offices in New York. So we had a lot of, actually I'm just gonna quote something Eric Schneiderman once said to the person who was running this little grubby campaign, where all the people involved in it ended up having to borrow money from their parents to pay the rent. He said basically that in Albany, anyone there would do anything for a ham sandwich. So that's basically Albany for you.
Nice. Well, I guess you, and then Sarah, maybe? Hi.
Great. Hi. This is a question for both of you. I read All the Birds in the Sky a few years ago, and it was one of my still all-time favorite books in recent years. And
Oh my God.
I've been very eager to read The Country of Ice Cream Star. And I know both books in very different ways play with genre. All the Birds in the Sky is YA, it is it's sci-fi, it's fantasy, and then Country of Ice Cream Star plays with dystopian so well. So I'm wondering if you can talk in your experience as authors about writing genre, but also potentially as readers, your experience with genre?
Yeah, I mean, I think genre is sort of, you know, increasingly, as in this sort of postmodern era, it's increasingly just like a set of like colors that you can paint with. And I think the idea that you write in a particular genre is really weirdly antiquated. I don't think anybody writes in a genre anymore. I think people write using like different paintbrushes or different like colors or different whatever metaphor you want. And like if you think about what's popular in pop culture now, it's all genre crossing. It's all like superhero movies where you've got like Captain America side by side with the Hulk, side by side with Doctor Strange and Iron Man, and like, you know, you've got fantasy and sci-fi on screen together all the time now, and like most major, and Star Wars where you've got wizards in space basically, and you know, Adventure Time, and like basically any successful pop culture thing you can think of for the last like 20 years just doesn't care about genre. And at the same time, the boundary between literary fiction and quote-unquote genre fiction has been completely demolished. Like at this point, it's been just broken down. And there's you know, people can still judge a book by like what publisher name is on the spine, but that's silly. And it's really just like there are different writing styles, there are different subjects that you can tackle, but it's all it all blends together. And I think that, you know, part of what was fun for me in All the Birds in the Sky, and to some extent in City in the Middle of the Night too, was just like trying to like tell a story that I hopefully hadn't entirely seen before, using like all of the different kind of tools that are out there, and kind of letting somebody else worry about what label to put on it, kind of, if that makes any sense. And like also, part of it is like who you're stealing from. So like in this book, I'm stealing from like Vonnegut, but also Le Guin and Butler and Doris Lessing always. And so it's to the extent that I'm stealing from people who have different labels on them, I guess those labels then accrue to my work. I don't know.
Yeah, I just want to sort of briefly respond, because I think I grew up, my father was an engineer and he only read science fiction. So my entire idea of what adult fiction was science fiction for my formative years as a reader. And then I sort of discovered realist adult fiction after that, and thought of it as something that was almost experimental at first. And I think that, you know, I've begun to be of the opinion that this is actually recapitulating the history of writing, because originally most stories are fantasy stories, like not specifically science fiction, but science fiction and fantasy are, as far as I'm concerned, essentially the same thing. And then we gradually invent realism, originally largely as a way of pretending that something is a true story. Like Robinson Crusoe was originally sold as a true story, which was just a way of marketing books back in the 18th century. And then it turned out that people continued to enjoy those stories even once they knew that they weren't true. So anyway, that's just my take on it.
Sarah, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I was wondering, Charlie Jane, whether you had the planet first or the plot, like whether this was you were reading about tidally locked planets and then came up with something from there, or vice versa.
I definitely had the planet first, and the process with this book was unlike anything else I've ever written. Like for All the Birds in the Sky, for example, I had the characters, and then I just kind of like grudgingly, I mean not grudgingly, but I came up with the world building as I went. I was like, okay, fine, she's going to magical school. I can't just like say, it's hog farts, and then like just change Hogwarts a little. I have to come up with a magic school that's like different and interesting in its own way. But with this, the world came first, and I had an agonizing 2 years during which I was writing and writing and writing in blank journals, and it was all pretty much garbage, but it sketched in the world. And by the time I actually figured out the characters to put in that world, which basically only happened after I quit IO9 in the spring of 2016, then I was like, I can focus on this finally. When I came up with the characters to put in that world, the world was already incredibly detailed and incredibly like fleshed out. So that was really unusual, but it started completely with obsessing about tidally locked planets and trying to imagine what that would be like. And then that kind of led to the world building, which led eventually, finally, to the characters.
Just want to quickly remind everyone to please come up to the microphone to ask your question. We are recording, and if you don't speak into the mic, we won't get your question in the recording.
Okay. Pat, maybe do people want to line up at the mic? I know that's kind of like convention-y, but I don't know. It might be better. Hi.
Charlie, we met at the book thing down at the convention center a couple years ago, and I had to show you the cheerleader outfit.
Oh yeah. Oh, Huskies.
How are you?
Go
Anyway,
Huskies.
and just you know, I got here late. I apologize, but you were talking about things not being easily defined and mixing genres and stuff like that. And as a music journalist, I can say that in the music field there is definitely a parallel evolution. Things going on with different genres mixing. In a world music, you have electronics mixing with ethnic traditions, all kinds of stuff like that. So just to say that this seems to be a thing going on in the culture generally.
Yeah. Well, and thank you. And I mean, I think I actually went to a panel at the Brooklyn Book Festival last year or something, where these music journalists, Nelson George and a couple of people were talking, and they were basically like, you know, a lot of the labels in music are kind of weirdly segmented by race and by other stuff, like Led Zeppelin and Funkadelic were doing a lot of the same music, but one was labeled funk and one was labeled rock, and it's just a random thing. Yeah, anyway, thanks for the observation. Does anybody have a question for Sandra? Because I've gotten 2 questions in a row. Yeah, hi.
I actually have a question about your previous book, The Country of Ice Cream Star. And the narrative voice, for anybody who's read it, the narrative voice is incredibly unique. And I want to know how easy it was for you to get into that when writing. I can imagine it was incredibly immersive as a reader, but it's also very, very different than what most people will have read before.
Okay, so, I mean, for people who haven't ever seen the book at all, it's set at about 100 years after an imaginary apocalypse. And the, spoken English has changed in that period of time. So it's written in this kind of invented futuristic dialect of English, which is, it's got a little French in it, it's obviously, if you read it, influenced by African American vernacular English. And it's also just kind of, warped or drifted a little bit to the side of how we speak now. And it was interesting, I came up with the idea of changing the English, and then a few days later, like with just a few simple ideas, I started writing it. And I don't want to make it sound like I'm a genius who was able to do this. It was one of the most magical things that has happened to me in my life, coming up with that dialect. And as soon as I started writing it, I became fascinated with it, and it was one of the most pleasurable things in my life, writing that book and coming up with all of the idioms that this other kind of post-apocalyptic people come up with to describe their world and their feelings, and how a ball flies in the air and all of this. So So yeah, it was very difficult, but the difficulty was of the kind that is pleasure.
Thanks.
I actually, today was the first day I bought a book by Charlie Jane Anders, because I went to your series in San Francisco called Writers with Drinks, and I was just curious if any, so sorry that it's not a reference to the books, but when I read the first page of The City in the Middle of the Night, it instantly brought me back to when you would introduce people, and I was wondering maybe if you were using your own scripts to introduce people. I'm not sure, but have you ever been approached by a professional, like, entertainment company, like a production crew, to come and put your show so that people around the country could see what you're doing?
Oh, wow.
It's very unique, and
Well,
I
thank you.
loved your emceeing.
Oh, thank you. So for those of you who haven't made it to this thing in San Francisco, I do a show once a month called Writers with Drinks, and I make up weird fictional bios for the authors, and they kind of get like, they get a little bit like magical realist, kind of surreal, like weird, and it's really a fun exercise. I used to just kind of make them up on the fly as I like get up on stage and just kind of riff, and that I decided over time that wasn't the best idea. So now I actually do kind of come up with stuff in advance, and then kind of, you know, there's a little bit of improv in there as well. And you know, I find that a really fun exercise, just in coming up with a bunch of like microfiction in like a one-day period before the show. And also just kind of like thinking about this author and why I was excited to have them here. So I feel like The City in the Middle of the Night is I mean, I feel like it leaks into everything I do, because it's this, I love, like, a lot of those intros are very surreal, and I love coming up with that. And they're often sillier than maybe this book is, but I think All the Birds in the Sky, my previous book, had a lot of that in there, had a lot of that kind of like, you know, silliness out of nowhere, kind of surreal stuff going on in it. And my YA, which I'm working on now, also has a fair amount of that as well, because it's a kind of slightly funny space opera where there's just like weird stuff all the time. But thank you so much, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
So I have a question for the both of you, and obviously to be a good writer, you have to be a wide reader. But I'm curious, so in terms of what classic work of literature does everyone else love, but you personally hate?
Those kinds of questions. Sorry, I'm just trying to think. Oh, man. I mean, I haven't actually read it, I'm going to admit that, but I know that the book Middlesex is something that a lot of my intersex friends cannot stand. And so I'm going to just say Middlesex by Jeff Eugenides, because I know that in the intersex community there's a lot of like complaints about that book.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think. There are a lot of classic works of literature that I don't care for, but I'm not sure if everyone else loves them. Does everyone else love The Scarlet Letter? I don't think so. So I do have a bit of a pet peeve against Hemingway, but it's not really that I don't like his writing. I really just cannot stand his personality.
I actually came up with a better one, which I have read, unlike the other one, which I hadn't. Myra Breckenridge by Gore Vidal. I don't know if anybody likes it anymore, but it was a huge, like, ginormous bestseller back in the day. It was like one of the most successful, it was like basically one of the most successful books of the late 60s. It was on everybody's list of like the best books ever for a while. It was made into a movie starring Mae West and Raquel Welch, weirdly, and Tom Selleck. And it's a terrible movie. Even Gore Vidal thought it was a terrible movie, but it's a horrible book. It's a really horrible book. It's incredibly transphobic. It's the only book that anybody read about trans people for a very long time. And it's also full of sexual violence that's supposed to be funny. And there's a lot of rape in that book that's played for laughs. And if you read it now, it's just, I mean, even if you read it then, it's horrifying. It's a terrible book, and I can't stand it. else? Oh,
I have another one.
Okay.
On the airwaves here, but, you were both talking a little bit about your style, Charlie Jane with your kind of surrealist, maybe more off-the-wall style, and then in your previous book, the language that you were getting to for this post-apocalyptic world. For both of you, how much of that comes, through the revision process, or just a little bit about the process of how you get to that place where you're kind of creating that sustained rhythm and energy to keep up the voice in those books?
I think, personally, I always find the first page takes almost as much time as the rest of the book. So once I have the voice really alive and it's working, and I've revised the first page so that it feels like the first page of a real book, I can write a book. But sometimes it can take me up to a year to really get a first page. So, and it's interesting that there's never it never seems to get that much easier. I have to reinvent the wheel every single time.
Yeah, I definitely have to reinvent the wheel every single time, and part of it is that I keep trying to do stuff that's different. Like, I really consciously made City in the Middle of the Night as different as I could from All the Birds in the Sky, apart from both having really long titles, and I guess having in the title, but other than that, but yeah, it's really like a lot of what I think of as my style is something that I've developed over a long period of time, like over the past, 20 years of writing fiction, just like having like a kind of instinct for, the rhythm of prose or whatever and stuff. But I always, the revision process is always this process of refining and kind of distilling and realizing, kind of just listening to my gut and being like, okay, this scene is not quite working, I need something else here. What is actually really going on with these characters here, and just kind of pulling at it and poking at it. And if you read one of my earlier drafts, some of the same sentences would be there, but it would just be kind of rough and kind of jerky, and kind of I'm always really grateful to my beta readers who put up with the kind of slightly half-baked drafts that I give them, because there's always something missing and I don't know what, and often it's not until several rounds of poking and working with Miriam, my editor, and Patrick also at Tor, and just figuring out what the heck I'm missing. But it's a really tough process, and a lot of the good stuff does come in revision for sure. And actually, City in the Middle of the Night didn't have its first chapter until fairly late. It started with what's now the second chapter was the first chapter. What's now the second or third chapter was the first chapter, and then I was I need to kind of ease into this a little bit more. And so that was almost the last thing I wrote. Cool. So we got time for maybe a couple more questions? I don't know. Hi.
When I write, I listen to a lot of music, and I was wondering if that's something you do, if there's a kind of music you like to put you in the mood to write, or if not, if you have any other habits that you like to do when you write, or to get you in the mood to write.
Yeah, I create a playlist for every book that I write over time, and a lot of the time, it's gradually just turned out, and it is just a playlist that's designed, I could go for long walks and listen to the music, and whatever songs are effective in putting me into the mood end up staying on the playlist. So.
Yeah, I always listen to music as I write, especially when I'm writing in cafes. And in San Francisco, if you go sit in a cafe to write, unless you get way out of the main part of town, you're going to be surrounded by people talking about their business plans and customer utilization and how to, actualize customer, whatever. Anyway, and are you going to be a team player? I'm going to be a team player. I don't know. Anyway, not to be mean to I'm sure what they're doing is awesome, but I do have headphones on and I do listen to music. But it really varies. My main music that I always listen to is kind of old school funk and R&B. But for this book, I think I listen to a lot of Mountain Goats actually. And for my YA, one of the main characters in my YA is a transgender or travesti girl from Brazil. And I've been talking a lot on Skype with a trans person in Brazil to help me with that. And she recommended some music, which I've been listening to a lot. There's so much great Brazilian funk being made by trans people right now. Linda Quebrada, Lineker Eos Caramelos, Saliento. I'm probably butchering their names, but There's some amazing music right now being made by trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming people in Brazil that is just like so fucking incredible. So that's been a big playlist for me with this book, with the YA. Cool. So maybe like one more question? What do you think? Okay, one more? Anybody? Last question? Okay.
I was recently listening to an interview with Marlon James, and he was talking about the process for writing his new novel, and he talked about a lot of the research you have to do when you're building a world, including into just like geography and like meteorology and like how things work. Do either of you have like a similar approach? Like, what's the research like for creating a fictional world like this?
It's kind of endless, actually. There's so much research. I mean, I'm always trying to get offline to write, but it becomes impossible. And especially with this book, because there are so many scenes set in the Elizabethan period, and you sort of don't realize you can't have someone wake up in bed and just have them wake up in bed. You need to know what Elizabethan blankets were like. You need to know, what people ate for breakfast in the Elizabethan period, and so on and so forth. So every single thing would take 10 hours of research.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the project. For this book, I talked a lot to a geophysicist named Lindy Elkins-Tanton, who works some on tidally locked planets, and she also helped Vandana Singh write a novella or a novelette about a tidally locked planet recently. So she's amazing, and she helped me with some of the geology and some kind of what it would be like on the planet. I just read a lot. I read a lot of articles about tidally locked planets and kind of just like chatted with people, and also read a lot about trauma and stuff because that's a big thing in the book. I guess for me, my default mode as an author, to be honest, is to just make shit up and then basically try to trick people into thinking that I know what I'm talking about. So I will do whatever research I have to do to trick you into thinking that I actually know what I'm talking about. And that depends on if it's a novel set in the present day in the real world, quote unquote, then I'll just make sure that the details track with what people know. But in general, I'm mostly a BS artist as an author, and especially if I'm making up a fictional world, the most important thing for me is that it feel lived in and not like a painted backdrop, and not like a not like a painted backdrop, not like I just kind of slapped up some stuff, and that there has to be a feeling that if you just walked off in some direction, you would keep encountering stuff. And that's partly just like self-hypnosis. It's partly figuring out stuff and talking to people and doing research, but a lot of it is also just like working out enough details that are internally consistent that I kind of believe this place exists and I can write about it for as long as I need to, if that makes any sense. I feel like writers are really macho about research. I've noticed this. Writers are like, we're like weightlifters. It's like, oh, I benched like 10,000 encyclopedias to do this book. It's like a super macho thing for writers to brag about how much research we do. And I always feel embarrassed by being like, well, I do research, but I really don't like doing it. And also I'm always happiest when I'm just like BSing. Anyway, sorry. Okay, this is definitely the last question. Oh, you're not asking your question either. You're Ari. Sorry, you're Ari. Hi.
Hi. So if nobody else has another question, I'm sure our authors would be very happy to sign your books for you. If you haven't bought one yet, you can grab them from the register, and you can find a signing line to the right of this table here. Let's give the authors one more round of applause.